Let's talk about a book that's caused a huge stir, Charles Murray's Human Diversity. Now, our goal here isn't to take sides. It's simply to break down the book's core arguments, pulling them straight from the source itself. So, right at the start, the book sets up what it calls the prevailing orthodoxy in academia. It presents these three statements as the dominant worldview in the social sciences. And this is the very worldview it was written to challenge, using evidence from biology and genetics. And here's the source itself. Just to be crystal clear, for this explainer, we are sticking strictly to the arguments as they are laid out right here in these pages. We're here to understand the author's perspective and see exactly how he built his case. All right, so what's the game plan? We're going to walk through Murray's case piece by piece. First, we'll look at how he defines this orthodoxy. Then we'll dive into his arguments on gender, race, and class. And we'll finish up with what he calls his settled propositions. Okay, first up, the prevailing orthodoxy. This is really the intellectual backdrop for the entire book. At the heart of this orthodoxy is a concept Murray coins the sameness premise. What does that mean? Well, it's the idea that when we see big differences in life outcomes between large groups of people, the default assumption should be that society's to blame, things like discrimination, not that biology might play a role. And here's the book's central thesis. Murray argues that this sameness premise is starting to fall apart. Why? He says there's a tidal wave of new research coming out of genetics and neuroscience that makes ignoring biology, well, impossible. To help us kind of visualize where the science is on each of these topics, Murray uses a really cool analogy, an archaeological dig. For gender, he says, the dig is well underway, and we found a ton of artifacts. For race, it's like we're just breaking ground at a really promising new site. And for class, it's like we're going back to an old dig, but this time with powerful new tools to see what we missed before. So let's start with that most excavated site, gender. The book's argument here is that the differences we see between men and women aren't just cultural quirks, but they are deeply rooted in biology. So you've got this direct face-off of ideas. On one side, you have the social construct view that says gender differences are just products of our culture. And on the other, you have the book's view, which argues that actually, many of these differences are partly genetic, and you can absolutely measure them. Now, to back this up, Murray uses some pretty complex statistics. A key tool he relies on is called Mahalanobis D. I know, it sounds intense, but the book explains it with a great analogy. Imagine you want to find the true distance between two towns. You can't just average their latitude and longitude, right? You need to account for altitude, too. Mahalanobis D does something similar for groups, giving you one single number that captures the overall difference across a whole bunch of different traits at once. So, what does Murray say he finds when he uses tools like this? He makes some really specific claims. For instance, he argues that women have a genetic leg up in verbal ability, that men are generally more interested in things while women are more interested in people, and that things like hormones and brain chemistry play a major role in these patterns. Okay, now we're moving into what is, without a doubt, the most controversial section of the book, race. Here, Murray brings in population genetics to argue that genetically distinct ancestral populations are a real, measurable thing. To set the stage, Murray uses a famous quote from the biologist Stephen Jay Gould. Gould's point was that human biological sameness across races was basically a lucky accident of history, but Murray's argument is that new genetic research has completely overturned that idea. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Murray actually agrees with a key point that his critics often make. As you can see from these kinds of charts, most genetic variation is found within a population, not between them. In other words, two people from Britain are likely to be more genetically different from each other than one of them is from a person in Italy. And Murray says, yep, absolutely true. But, and this is the crucial turn in his argument, he says that if you zoom in and look only at the genes that have been linked to cognitive traits, the picture changes. He claims that a significant chunk, 34%, of the differences in those specific genes between continental populations are large. And he argues that's a signal we just can't afford to ignore. Okay, so we've gone through gender and race. Now let's get to the final piece of the puzzle, class. Here, the book makes the case that our genes play a significant role in where we land on the socioeconomic ladder. So take a look at this chart. According to the studies Murray cites, it's a breakdown of what influences our success in the workplace. Genes, a big slice of the pie. But what's really shocking here is shared environment. That's all the stuff you share with your siblings, like your parents' income or education. According to the book, its influence is zero. I mean, that's a pretty radical claim. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? Murray argues that if our outcomes are so heavily influenced by our genes and so little by the environment we're raised in, then there's a natural limit to what social programs and policies can actually do to change things. Finally, the book wraps everything up by presenting what it calls 10 propositions. These are claims the author believes are so strongly supported by evidence that they should basically be considered settled science. And these propositions are really a summary of the book's main arguments. They state that differences between men and women are real and partly biological, that human evolution didn't just stop in the distant past, that the family environment you grew up in has a much smaller impact than we tend to think, and, as a result, that social interventions have real built-in limits. So what's the bottom line? Murray ends with a really bold prediction that biology is about to completely turn the social sciences on their head. And that leaves us with a huge question to think about. If he's right, what would that new world of knowledge even look like? And what on earth would it mean for all of us?